Well, greetings and salutations, and welcome back to the show's second half of today's upload. Before we get into it, though, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. The links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below, my merch displayed directly under this video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description as well. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's take that walk on the controversial conspiracy side, shall we? So it really doesn't matter whether it's the United States brand of democracy for export or the national specific model of government that strengthens non-Western states. The theoretical concept behind this system has been weaponized by military intelligence agencies worldwide in a back and forth effort to change or retain the deep state status quo. Most people are familiar with the U.S.'s clandestine and militant export of democracy across the globe in order to remove uncompliant leaders and to promote its enduring geostrategic interest to retain its own unipolar dominance. But comparatively fewer have ever thought about how this very same system is actually a method of control, no matter what iteration it ultimately takes. This isn't a judgment, but a fact. Democracy is really a tool that's expertly wielded by its deep state practitioners in order to retain the status quo in their states. Whether this is good or bad depends on one's perspective. Most people in the alternative media community would argue that it's the former, so long as the country in question is protecting their independent policies from outside United States Western Gulf interference and striving to construct the multipolar world order. While the mainstream media would of course see it as the latter, by derogatorily framing it as a managed democracy or at worst, a dictatorship. Along the same token, the alternative media community believes that the United States is a fake democracy and practices an insincere iteration of this ideology, while the mainstream media extols it as the best model in the world. Nevertheless, it isn't about arguing whether democracy is good or bad system, or even rendering judgment on the variation that certain countries have chosen to implement, but to describe how the ideology itself has come to constitute the core of the military intelligence operations across the world in carrying out long-term offensive and defensive missions. The four-step strategy, the military intelligence, is almost always directed against foreign targets, and there are multiple ways to describe the practice of this art. But the most relevant one is to draw attention to a four-step process that interestingly begins and ends with democracy. The first step is to develop concepts that can serve to widen social divisions that provoke this crisis and allow for the implementation of reverse-engineered endgame solutions. While there are many theories that can catalyze this sequence and conclude it, regardless of whether they are the same for fulfilling both roles or are different, democracy is the most effective for killing two birds with one shot. Part of the universal appeal for democracy is that people believe that it is the best way to hold decision makers accountable in ensuring that they fulfill their promises to increase the living standards for a general population and empower individuals to actualize their full potential. Democracy, however, is also the proverbial Pandora's box. And there's no going back once the ideas of this theory have either been introduced or practiced in society. By its very nature, democracy is capable of widening societal divisions, especially in identity diverse and mostly post-colonial states of the global south that are increasingly occupying a more significant geostrategic position in the world's affairs due to their location and economical potential, which satisfies the second step of military intelligence operations. Depending on the composition of the targeted country, which the United States can become intimately aware of through big data social media analytics, and the presumable de facto covert rival of the brief Cold War era Project Camelot, various hybrid war scenarios can be hatched for bringing the state to crisis and weaponizing the chaos in order to implement reverse engineered solutions for normalizing the resultant systematic change. Putting it plainly, and in context of the United States' militant pro-sealization of democracy, the ideal or the same relevant variation therefore becomes appealing to the targeted population and eventually encourages or serves as a front for destabilizing societal divisions that eventually disrupt the status quo by catalyzing or crisis and paving the way for a regime change against the government. To visualize the process in its most naked conceptual terms, theory/concept, societal division disruption, crisis, implementation of the predetermined solution. Those are the four steps. So theory/concept, societal division or disruption, crisis, implementation of the predetermined solution. Democracy is the United States' ideological weapon of choice because it allows for the management of creative destruction within the system that periodically allows the public to peacefully vent their frustrations by electoral recycling their civilian elites without interfering with their country's permanent military, intelligence, and diplomatic bureaucracies, or the deep state. This is advantageous from the external perspective of dominance because it allows the United States to indirectly retain control over its vessels or, when needed, manipulate the democratic process in order to legally install their public placeholder of preference. How do we manage the blowback? There are times, however, when democracies fail to prevent the emergence of system-threatening elites, in which case the United States instrumentalizes various deep state levers of pressure against the elected revolutionary in order to offset their planned changes, just like it's presently doing in Moldovan President Dodon. If the newly elected figure cannot be co-opted or functionally neutralized, like US's ally India is attempting to do with the newly elected Chinese-friendly communist government in Nepal, prior, or its official formation in what should be the next coming months, when it'll either resort to carrying out a coup or launching a hybrid war. Should that fail, then the direct military intervention of its lead from behind partners or even the US itself becomes possible per the Libyan model. However explained, the external manipulation of democracy for offensive geostrategic and regime change ends by the US. It's now time to discuss how it's been used by countries for defensive purposes as well. Democracy is the means, not the end, and it's become a tool for perpetuating the deep state status quo and keeping the permanent bureaucracy in power and sometimes even the public ones as well, while superficially or sincerely giving the citizens a chance to hold certain decision makers to account in hopes that they'll eventually bend to the majority's political will in carrying out policies that will ultimately benefit the people. As such, democracies become nothing more than a pressure valve in the most cynical sense for distracting the masses or indoctrinating them with the belief that this is the most effective means for actualizing real change while staving off any real systematic threat to the deep state. Democracy, or some variation thereof, almost always remains the first and final step of this process, while the neutral divisions that it creates are handled through the control crisis of elections. Like was mentioned at the beginning of the analysis, this could be interpreted as good if it prevents a violent and possible externally supported minority from overthrowing an elected multipolar government, or bad if it enables an unpopular public figure, or gray cardinal, or dictator to remain in power contrary to the genuine will of the majority of the population, though it must be qualified that the latter state of affairs could be manipulated through foreign info wars in order to manage the masses' perception to its end. Either way, the creative destruction inherent in democracy systems gives the deep state the best chance for controlling the citizens in the most cost-effective manner, controversial, limiting the pace of actual change in democracy's original concept mission to let this process flow freely and according to the public's will. Offensive versus defensive. Well, when the United States supports groups relying on democratic slogans to overthrow the leadership of other democracies, whether Western-like in Poland or national-specific, such as Syria, it is counting on them to introduce another variant of democracy to justify their part of power and create a smokescreen for carrying out deep state purge afterwards to replace the prior decision makers with their own. Controversially, the defensive application of democracy is used to cycle out unpopular leaders and safely introduce new ideas into the governing apparatus that are not revolutionary enough to rock the boat and threaten the deep state, thus giving the public means through which they can periodically provide constructive feedback and channel their frustrations by pointing the authorities in the direction that they need to go in order to retain the mass of support. The above-mentioned two examples represents the conclusion of military intelligence weaponization of democracy, according to the offensive and defensive manifestations of the four-step sequence, because it begins and ends with democracy itself, albeit sometimes renormalizing the concept in a final phase depending on whether there is a visible shift in the public elite. Like it was earlier remarked, the control nature of deep state elites managing creative destruction within their systems is contrary to the pure theoretical definition of democracy in allowing this process to freely unfold based on the public's will. One should be careful to avoid attaching any judgment to this observation, however, because the pro-life of mass and social media, as well as the ease of which foreign forces can manipulate targeted citizens abroad through these means, suggests that having certain safeguards may actually be a responsible move, through provided that it is not abused. The Trump anomaly. With that in mind, Trump's election was a real revolution because the same system-threatening development that occasionally occurs abroad in endangering the deep state actually took place in the United States itself, and without an external melding to boot. The Kraken is now trying to carry out changes within the same democracy that had assumed that it was immune from anything of the sort ever happening, which is why hostile, liberal, globalist members of the deep state are activating levers of institutional pressure to counteract his changes, just like what Trump's administration is ironically doing against Moldova's Dodon. Even so, Trump is pragmatic enough to counterproductively inhibit the democratic execution of his desired vision by congressional means, and has thus worked with certain deep state figures when necessary, hence why his former ally Bannon backstabbed him in an unsuccessful bid to break what he truly believed was Trump's counter-revolutionary presidency. Some concluding thoughts. There is nothing inherently good or bad about democracy, as such judgment calls are subjective, but one can objectively argue that the model itself is the most effective one for fulfilling military intelligence four-step mission, whether operationalizing for offensive use abroad, like the US does, or defensive reasons at home, such as how it's employed by Iran. This too is not good or bad, but is a simple fact of life that few people have become aware because the existence of some sort of democratic motions is now taken for granted almost across the world and has to channel the fourth and final step of the military intelligence process become normalized. This isn't to say that the solution is to dilute democracy or even that a solution is necessary at all, but just to draw attention to a little known aspect of modern day life that often eludes the notice of most political analysts and encourage readers to think outside of the box in reconceptualizing the world around them. So, right there is how deep state, which is the military intelligence agencies, and the elite use something that we Americans and others who are abroad, who live in democracies, take and hold so dearly. Like, I hold on to my rights as an American very dearly. I was raised and went to school in the 80s and 90s before the change, the scholastic regime change. So I was sort of taught the truth. Sort of. Not the lies that our children are being taught now. This is how they use democracy to achieve world control. We see it every day. We're actually seeing it right now unfold in front of us. We're seeing it to the north and we're seeing it to the east of us. When it's in black and white, you can't ignore it. You can only try to paint it a certain color. Paint it pink and call it Pollyanna. But you can't do that, can you? Anyway, I hope I didn't offend anybody. That was not my attempt. Just sharing with you some information that I thought was interesting. With that, practice kindness. May the Great Spirit watch over us all. And may He guide us down that path of life.